Hello, is empathy a weakness? But before we start out, we should clarify what it means. Which would be the ability to share someone else's feelings or experiences by imagining what it would be like to be in that person's situation. Although I would argue it's largely automatic. If it takes a conscious effort, then by not extending that conscious effort, you can pretty much opt out. And there's also another term, cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy means that you can understand another person's perspective. It also referred to as perspective taking or putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And a good way to put it that cognitive empathy requires intellect, but also kind of knowledge and obviously perspective. So this is something that you can really broaden by reading books and just knowing people. But also emotional empathy can be refined with experience and compassion. But it is worth saying that compassion only is really relevant with the right mindset. So suppose you are fully bought into the "we're all rivals, we must fight it out," then you're probably not going to have a lot of compassion for others. And cognitive empathy can help motivate others, but I would argue both can, although cognitive empathy would allow you to take a distance from others. So you don't have to share their feelings, which is both a pro and a con, because if they have positive feelings, you might want to share it. But if they have negative feelings, then it would probably not be effective to share those, because now they possibly needed help, and now both of you are drowning. So cognitive empathy is about learning about others, and as previously stated, emotional empathy is inappropriate in every situation. Now, it can be rewarding and satisfying, but especially if we are not in the realm of positive, with perhaps some negative put in like very sparingly, then it's gonna be probably counterproductive. So, between these, we can see that empathy, that is usually it's called, and I'm calling it emotional here, but it is just how it's understood in normal cases, that you are kind of vulnerable. So you can argue that it's a weakness. And clearly it's a vulnerability. Well, cognitive empathy, on the other hand, would be straight up a strength. Now, emotional empathy is always limited by your own experience and, of course, the way you see the world. And those who really claim that, oh yeah, I really feel what they are feeling, you don't. You're just kind of guessing. Possibly you are sensitive, but you are not empathetic in the sense that you feel what they feel. And that is a very key distinction. Yet, even within classic empathy, I would make a distinction between considering the individual and considering the collective. Because if you merely consider the individual, then you can very easily argue that it's a vulnerability at least. And it is situationally can be something that's positive. But otherwise it can be a weakness. And we can see it that marketing is trying to prey on you. Others are probably trying to further their interest against yours. And fundamentally, many things don't make sense in our world if you have a very individualistic mindset. Because the fundamental conclusion would be that your best way to be would be amoral, megalomaniac psychopath. And anything else really gets in the way. And even we can argue that the positive aspects of empathy are negative too in this context, because you might overcommit, right? That is just a weakness. And I don't think I need to push my point too hard to point out that others do try to use whatever empathy you have against you for their ends. And when life kind of favors you, you're probably gonna adopt the view that is how the world is, or I'm superior, or whatever. But if things are not going as a peachy, then it's gonna be help me, how unfair, and F the status quo. Yet, looking at the collective, then even though you can argue that being empathetic is a weakness, possibly for the individual, but it is a plus for the group. Not like everyone is gonna be or really anyone is gonna be a cold calculator, perfect calculator. And it's truly not just about your genes, but you share a lot of genes with other people. You share 99% plus of your genes with others. Now, you might prefer yours, but you gotta admit that's pretty damn close. But also, this recognizes a reality that if you were just alone, like let's say in the middle of the desert, what can you do? You can't even keep humanity going with that setup, but also, even that would be insufficient. You would need a big group, right? I think like 10,000 people plus. And for that, you need a collective. And in fact, right now, we have 8 billion people. And that is connected through the internet, which means that we can share knowledge and we basically just form some kind of a computer where effectively, the more of us around, the better it is. And I'm not even making the argument that you have to be a hopeless puppet, but that caring is positive. Let's say that you were going somewhere, obviously, you got your own life and your own interest, but you see one guy just bleeding out, right? Now, with an entirely competitive mindset, you gotta be thinking like, wow, one less guy to worry about in my competition game. Also, dealing with this would waste my time. So, my best choice is just to leave. That would be the self-evident conclusion. And the unfortunate reality is that it is very close to what we have right now. We have a bunch of people who are sleeping in the streets, and no one cares if they die. If they were just about to die, then we might care. But if they're gonna die like even like a few hours later or a few days later, who cares? Yet it would be really hard to argue that this is something that furthers humanity. But it might be something that furthers the individual, so. And here I'm not claiming that the individual, in this case, would be a slave to some kind of leader, right? Because that is kind of how it's usually presented. You have a brutal dominance hierarchy, and you call it cooperation. And it's clearly not. And many things that might seem completely incomprehensible, like being gay, although you can argue that it's a mistake. But in a collectivist mindset, or at least considering the collective here, it is pretty much irrelevant unless it's really an all hands on deck when it comes to making kids, which is pretty much never the case. Yet in our modern world, even that wouldn't be a valid argument. And I will further emphasize the aspect of satisfaction that could be overlooked, but it is quite crucial for consistent action. Because suppose you don't care at all, right? It's gonna be really hard to do things. Like, let's suppose someone was apathetic. Would you say this is a superpower? Clearly, they are not burdened by any kind of nonsense, but they're also missing out on all of the good. And if they have control over their lives, then clearly they can tilt it more toward positives. So not caring and pretending to not care is not as fun. Even in our world, let's suppose you can check out completely. Would you give up the positives for the potential that you become quote-unquote stronger to resist the negatives? And the reality is that many might wish for this, or possibly some already have it, because of how their life is unfolding. And to that, the classic narrow-minded take would be that, they must deserve it. So we have the just world fallacy, that those who have it good deserve it, and those who have it bad also deserve it. But realistically, that just either betrays stupidity or lack of care, or at most, just virtue signaling. Ideally, you want a system where caring is incentivized and rewarded. Because ultimately, no matter what you are, who you are, you will see the incentive structures, and you have to come to the realization that you can deviate from that, but it's gonna be something you have to live with. In fact, many might conclude that they will not even survive it, at which point they really don't have much of a choice. But especially in regards to getting to the top, what are we incentivizing?